lovelies, it's Miss Lady Lace here on my glamour channel. In today's fabulous video, we're going to be talking about vintage fashion and how to identify true vintage clothing. Vintage fashion is definitely one of my favorite topics to talk about. I've been collecting vintage and beautiful items since I was a child, and I'm always so happy to share what I've learned with anyone who's willing to listen. I'm definitely no fashion historian or expert, but I definitely hope this video may be useful if you're interested in learning more and being able to identify vintage clothing. In the world of vintage fashion, there are so many different terms that are floating around, and if you're looking to do some vintage shopping yourself or add an item to your collection, sometimes this can be a little bit confusing, especially if you're newer to the world of vintage fashion. I generally break pinup fashion down into two categories. We have reproduction clothing and true vintage clothing. Reproduction clothing is when an item is made to look like a specific era. They're essentially reproducing a certain style and making it in modern times. There are so many amazing modern reproduction brands which I really love, like Hell Bunny and Size Vintage. Our second category is true vintage clothing, which is the topic of today's video. It sometimes has a few other different terms like authentic vintage clothing, but essentially this is an item which was made in the era it looks to be from. So for instance, a 1950s true vintage dress is a dress that was made during the 1950s and is now over 70 years old. If you're watching today's video, you may be interested in starting your own true vintage wardrobe, or maybe you're looking to expand what you already have. But when searching for these items, it can be hard to ensure that they're definitely an authentic or true vintage item. And today we're going to be discussing how we can identify this. When I've been shopping myself both online and in person, I have seen many items incorrectly labeled. This may be because the person doesn't have an understanding of how to actually date an item, or it may be a deliberate attempt to mislead someone to buy something that they're saying is vintage. It's important we take some time to learn how we can help identify these items, so when we're shopping, we can ensure we're getting a quality and true vintage item. Before we take a deep look into how we can identify a true vintage item, I'd love to know in the comments below, what's your favorite type of clothing? Do you wear more reproduction, true vintage? Do you have a big true vintage wardrobe yourself? And maybe do you have an item that you have been looking for forever? I'd love to hear all of your comments below. So let's look at how to identify true vintage clothing. I've put together some points that I utilize myself when I'm out and about shopping. And I don't just use one method of identification, I combine multiple of these things that we're going to talk about to make the best assessment that I can to sort of date that item. Before I give these points, again, I am no fashion historian, I'm just sharing what I've learned from my own experiences, and if you have your own tips and tricks, do let me know in the comments below. Our first point is to look at the silhouette and style of the garment that we're looking at. When we look at an item, whether it's online or at a market, one of the first things we'll probably notice is the style and silhouette. It can be good to do research before you actually start vintage shopping and identify different trends and fashion silhouettes from different eras. Researching fashion trends, we see many different silhouettes emerging at different points in time. Now, I could definitely make a whole nother video breaking down different fashion trends and things that happened in different decades, which if you would like to see, do let me know in the comments below. If we pick up a beautiful item and we see it has that classic 1920s shape, so it's not emphasizing the waist, it's very much that almost column-like shape to the dress. While if we compare it to if we picked up a 1940s dress, we have that popular A-line shape, defined waist, and our hemline finishing just below our knees. When we go vintage shopping, we want to look at the style and silhouette and try and connect that to a certain decade. Fashion is super cyclical, so we see trends repeating throughout different decades. You'll want to watch out for eras reproducing other periods. For instance, during the 1980s, you definitely see throwbacks to the 1940s and 50s in their fashion, which is why it's important that you incorporate all the different points I'm going to talk about today to make your best judgment on the date of a dress. Point number 2 is the fabric that's been used. Different fabrics have been popular in different points in time. It's also worth researching when fabrics were invented and when they were commonly commercially used so you can understand if that dress is from a certain era. For the 20s and 30s, we see cotton, wool, and crepe silks all being quite popular. And during the 1940s and 50s, we see lots of fabulous fabrics like rayon, nylon, acetates, cotton, and wools. Stretch fabrics were invented in the late 1950s, but we see them more commercially used from the mid-60s onwards. If you have an item and the fabric seems too new, it's likely that that is a newer item. Quite often, the fabric content won't be listed on the garment if it's true vintage, so you can gauge this by touch and feel just to gauge what that is. I have seen other tests available online where you can burn a section of non-vital fabric. If it has certain scents, it'll tell you what sort of fabric that is. But definitely I'd be more cautionary of that and just use more a visual and touch guide to identify that fabric to help you gauge the age of that dress. Point number 3 are the finishings used on that item of clothing. When looking at an item, we can look at the exterior of the garment, we can look at buttonholes, zippers, and items such as this, as well as the stitch type used. We can also turn the item inside out to look at the interior of this to identify the age of the garment. Just like our fabrics, different finishings have been used in different eras. For our pre-1970s eras of clothing, we'll quite often see finishings like buttons with buttonholes, quite often beautifully matching or contrasting the item. We see things like hook and bars and zippers, and the zippers is a really strong telling point to what decade that dress is from. With our true vintage clothing, we often have an industrial metal zipper. So this is quite a heavy duty metal zipper, which often has a bit of age to it. You can feel that it feels older. It may even be a little bit rusted from wear and tear, but you can tell this is an older item of clothing just from this. We can compare this to a modern reproduction dress. This one here is from Zapaka and it's super cute. But looking at the zipper, we have that really fine plastic zip in this, which is a really big strong telling point that this would not be true vintage. It's definitely a reproduction item. For our zip placement, we quite often see this along the center back of the garments. With other true vintage dresses, we may find that there is a zipper on the side. Compared to new dresses where the zip will go right into the underarm, this will usually finish a little bit below the seam of the armpit and go from the hip up to this point and create a really beautiful silhouette once zipped up. Seams, hemlines, and the stitches used on an item will really indicate what era it is from. On a true vintage hemline, you often won't see stitching through this side of the garment, on the right side of the garment. It'll often be an invisible hem, so there'll just be tiny little catches through the fabric that put that into place. And if we look on the inside, we're not seeing overlocking on that item. It's just rolled up and stitched into place. Comparing this to an eye-size vintage dress I have, we can see stitching through the right side of the fabric, and if we look on the wrong side, we can see overlocking. So this is a big indicator of that era. Whilst the overlocker was invented in the 1880s, we really don't see the commercial use of that item until the 1960s and 1970s. So this is a good indication if an item has overlocking, it's likely post-1960s. There are definitely exceptions to these rules, as many people do repair items as they get older, and some overlocker use was used. But if you have a look at the stitches, you should be able to identify the fabric's a little bit older in certain places and newer in others. Looking at seams within the dress, for a true vintage dress, they will often be rawed and sometimes frayed from being used over time. Whilst with our modern dresses, we'll see overlocking on all edges to protect that item as best as possible. Point number 4 is to have a look at the label within the garment. I am such a big lover of vintage labels. They're just so beautiful and often very ornate. Pre-1970s, you'll definitely find so many dresses which do not have a label in them, and this could be for many reasons. Sometimes they have fallen out over time as they're usually hand-stitched into place. There are also many people who made their own clothing from patterns in magazines and newspapers. So I will showcase a few different vintage labels and compare them to some modern ones, but we can take a look at this beautiful little label here, which is House of Youth with model written underneath. It's hand-stitched into place, and it is that really beautiful vintage font which is so characteristic of the 40s and 50s. With our vintage labels, you quite often won't see a modern size listed. If there is a size on the label, it quite often won't be an indicator of modern sizing, as there was different sizing back in the 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s. We also won't see a garment care label instructing how to look after that item. While if we're looking at a modern piece of clothing, it will very much have that computer designed label, so it very much looks like it's been printed on. We have a modern size listed as well, and garment care on a lower side seam of the dress. So this would definitely be a modern dress versus our true vintage jacket. Point number 5 is the brand of clothing. If you're lucky enough to have a label on the dress you're looking at, you can definitely have a look and see if you can identify that brand. There are many iconic brands that really stand out through different eras. We can also do some research, do some Google hunts, do a hunt on Etsy, and see if there are any other clothing items popping up under that brand, and this may help identify the age of the dress, seeing when that company was in production. Quite often when I'm at markets, I do see things labeled incorrectly quite often, but one of the things that always stands out in my memory is I was at a market and there was an item listed as a 1920s blouse, and it had a Target label in it. Now there are definitely some vintage Target items, but Target the store was opened in 1962. You can definitely research brand names and big companies and find out when they were in production, so you can make sure you're buying a true vintage item that's matching this description you've been given. Point number 6 is the feel of an item. This point is definitely a little bit harder for me to convey talking through a video, and it's something you'll develop a little bit more as you become experienced in vintage shopping. Touching an item and getting a feel for the fabric definitely gives me an indication of the age of that garment. When we look at true vintage clothing, quite often we're looking at items that are between 60 and 100 years old. This means the fabric has definitely seen a lot of time, a lot of dust and all that jazz. So in feeling a fabric, I can feel when there's age to the dress. When I'm at a vintage market or a clothing store, I definitely go through the rack and have a little feel of everything, and that sort of gives me a gauge of the older dresses in there. I'll definitely go through and look at my different things like style and silhouette, but touch definitely gives me a big gauge of the age of a dress. So these have been my points and tips for identifying a true vintage dress. I utilize all these different aspects to best identify what era I think that dress is from. Now, something that definitely comes up when I post these sorts of videos is, do I think if you're interested in pinup and vintage fashion, do you have to dress in a true vintage style? And to answer that question, I say definitely not at all. I think pinup and vintage fashion is all about having fun, and there are no strict rules to this. You may not be able to wear true vintage fashion or be able to wear it on a daily basis for so many reasons. So I definitely don't think you need to feel pressure to wear a true vintage item, because it's definitely not practical, functional, or accessible for everyone. I think my biggest thing though is life is too short, so wear the pretty dress. I know many of my friends and followers often feel they don't have the courage to wear vintage fashion yet, but I think do what makes you happy and be the best version of yourself. If you're someone who's wondering where to find true vintage clothing and where to go vintage clothing shopping, the places I like to source my clothing from include vintage markets, vintage clothing stores, and of course antique stores. You can also find clothing on Etsy, Instagram, eBay, Facebook Marketplace. and just generally by Googling certain styles and looks, you can find websites that sell their own vintage clothing too. I have a whole range of other videos online right now that you can watch on the topic of vintage fashion, including things like my vintage shopping kit, which includes essential items I take when I go vintage shopping. I'll include some links in the description below, but if you would like to see more vintage fashion topics, do let me know in the comments too. So I do think this video is going to be quite a long one. I've been sitting here filming for quite a while now. If you've stayed to the end, thank you so much. At this point, I feel like I've said true vintage so much that it has no meaning anymore when you just repeat words over and over again until you question if they're words. So I feel I've gone a bit crazy at this point, but hopefully you find this video useful. I do hope you've enjoyed today's video, maybe finding it a little bit informative, and I really hope you can use some of these tips when you're vintage shopping yourself. Again, if you have any tips, tricks, or anything else you'd like to share on the topic of vintage clothing, do comment below and let me know all your thoughts. If you'd like to further support my YouTube channel, I am now on Patreon with early access to videos, behind the scene photos, and so much more. I'd like to thank all my patrons, especially my VIP patrons. We have Kane S and Sarah C. If you'd like to join my glamour community on Patreon, I'll include a link in the description below as well. If you'd like to follow my daily pinup adventures, I post super regularly to Instagram. I'll pop a link here as well as at the end of the video. And to never miss out on my vintage fun here on YouTube, be sure to hit the subscribe button below and turn on the bell notifications, and I will be seeing you all very soon.